Welcome to episode 9 of the Discovery Files. This is going to be our first video episode, so if you are listening to the audio only format, feel free to log on to our YouTube channel and you can watch the video of this interview with Nick Tate. Hopefully, you enjoy it and give us some feedback if you enjoy the format.
I had been involved in several discoveries in various relative amounts of people involved, from a huge team to just myself, and it's very different in all cases. But in every case, that there's always a series of points where something has to go right. Someone has to have one of those epiphany moments where they go, that's that's not what everyone thought before, and all of a sudden it's a discovery in inverted commas. But how do you define a discovery? Is it when the resource is defined? Does it then become a discovery? Is it the day that they turn the key on the plant so it actually produces something? Is that the discovery? Is it the day that some guy kicks the first rock in the field and goes, "Well, that looks interesting"? Everywhere along that chain, there are multiple points of critical decision making where, if you go one way, it's a discovery. If you go the other way, it's lost to the mists of time. So, whether you're doing it yourself or as part of a large team, there's always a whole series of those events. And with 2020 hindsight, when you do have a mine, then there's a whole bunch of people putting up their hand going, "Oh, gee whiz, I was there on that day that this happened," or whatever, and I discovered it, in inverted commas. Uh, as they say, success has many fathers and failure is always an orphan. So that
Yes.
that's triple true in mineral exploration. So, and I've lived that myself. So
Yeah,
I'll
and I
just
guess that's kind of a key difference between the 2, right? If you're doing a solo work. I mean, I remember earlier on in my career, I worked for little companies, and I was often the only geologist, and sometimes you're just figuring out the basics of geology all by yourself with no input, and I remember for me, it was early in my career, but I remember often wondering, "Am I wrong? Have I misidentified this rock? Have I misidentified the importance of this structure?" So it's an interesting, comparison to, like, large teams where you can ask 5 or 10 people an opinion on something and get it, right?
Yeah, and sometimes those bouncing ideas off other people just triggers a thought in your brain where, "Oh wow, if that was true, we should go and look there," or something like that. And sometimes, for me anyway, those thoughts just happen while I'm wandering along in the field, going from one creek to the next or something. It can happen in all kinds of environments, and so I'll just uh, quickly go through the two that I've
Yeah,
been
yeah.
involved in it. So the first one is the Pucam discovery in Laos, where I um, came on as a consultant for Pan Australian Resources. They'd done a joint venture with Normandy Anglo, who'd been in Laos for nearly 10 years. 94 to 97, I think, was their main sort of work period. They had a huge tenement, 5,000 square kilometres. They'd spent $10 million or something on just huge amounts of regional exploration. And they had a huge data set, and they'd identified this thing called Pucam, but it just, well, the copper price was low, the gold price was low, it didn't meet their thing, so they handballed it off to Pan Australian Resources. And Pan Australian, um, their initial target was to make an oxide gold operation and just get that bit going. And that's when I came on board, and they said, "Oh, look, we need this thing mapped. We want to understand the geology, and see what we do for it to drill out an ore body, a oxide gold ore body." That was the sort of where I came into it.
Mhm.
And the backstory for how the prospect was actually identified was, Normandy Anglo had done a big regional BLEG survey, stream BLEG survey, helicopter supported, and the highest result they got was 625 ppb. That was a fairly screaming anomaly.
Yeah.
So they sent, in a place where there were no known gold occurrences, so they sent their geologist, their main country geologist in there, Mike Harris. He went in there. The sample was actually quite near to the road that went to the I won't say state, province capital. It was just a few hundred meters from the road, and Mike drove down the road with a couple of Lao field hands, and they were going to go and have a look and see what they could see in the creek where the sample was taken and everything. And as they were driving down that road, Mike asked them, "What's the name of this place? What's it called?" And the field hands said, "Pucam." And in Lao, Pu is hill or mountain, Kam is gold, hill of gold. And Mike went, "Whoa, gee, that's a good start." but, but when I met him several years later, he said he was still never quite sure whether it really was called Pucam or whether they were just trying to encourage him to come back and do more work, because that, of course, meant more work for them and the people from their village. And I encountered that same effect a lot of times. So it's and because there were no other known gold occurrences there, that did seem a little odd. But
Mhm.
anyway, they went back, they collected some more stream sediment samples. They eventually collected a whole bunch of soil samples and identified this big anomaly, big copper gold anomaly, up to about 1,000 ppm copper in the soil and a gram gold in what was just kind of brown soil, a hill with a bunch of brown soil, not a lot of outcrop. They did find one or two little patches of magnetite outcrop, thought it might be a skarn or something. But anyway, then they did a little bit of drilling and intersected what they thought was some porphyry, and the grades were too low for them. As a porphyry, it just looked like it wasn't going to fly. So anyway,
Mhm.
but there were some little patches of gossan, and they had gold in them. They rock chipped them and got some gold out of it. And that's where Pan Australian came in. They thought, oh, maybe we can make an oxide gold operation out of this thing. And that's the point where I came in and started mapping on the surface. And I walked around for several days on all the old drill tracks. There were some old drill pads still in the bamboo there. And I was trying to find these outcrops of the gossan, and they weren't really even outcrops. They were just sort of lines of rubble. And on the geology map they had given me, they were marked as veins, like linear zones, veins of subcrop of gossan. And and on the sort of cartoon sections they'd drawn, they had these things as vertical veins of gossan. And, with numbers sort of up to about a gram and a half. And I thought, well, gee, that's just not going to hang together. It's not big enough, or there's not enough volume in it. But as I was mapping, I was wandering around the old drill tracks. I came to an old drill pad that had, just by chance, carved into one of these gossans, and it was still exposed in the back of the drill pad.
It's like the perfect situation, right?
Well, I just got lucky, it wasn't luck. That was the outcrop. And I looked at that and I went, that's not a vein. That's got bedding in it.
Yeah, it almost looks like a tuff with, fiame in it. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, it's all gossan. It's all oxide uh,
Okay, yeah.
gossan after pyrite, but it's got clear banding, bedding. There's other, gangue minerals, quartz and relics of other things in the gossan. But I went, that's not a vein. That's something better. It used to be a sediment or something else. It's been replaced by a bunch of sulfide, probably pyrite mostly. And on that day, I went, oh, this thing, all of a sudden, it's a replacement deposit. And that bedding, that particular outcrop was sub-horizontal, and I went, "Wow," so all of a sudden there's potential for many times the volume that it was as a bunch of veins, and and actually from that day forward, we then designed a drill program to test those things as though they were horizontal. Turns out they weren't. They were all folded all over the place, but they had a huge amount of volume that just wasn't there in the original interpretation
Yeah.
because they were replacement deposits, not veins.
It's
And
kinda interesting how many deposits getting the geology right. I mean, like I always talk about like how important geology is, right? But it's like getting those basic things right is sometimes the step that just kicks everything off, right? And then in hindsight, everybody goes, "Oh yeah, no, of course it's this."
yeah, yeah. Well, so that was what happened, and then, subsequently was drilled out and became a resource and, in fact, a mine. It started a mine, and, of course, there were many times along that way when there were, again, critical decisions about how much drilling there was and where we drilled and how they were gonna process it, where they were gonna build the plant, and the company nearly went broke several times trying to raise the capital to drill it out. It was a bit of a difficult time. Gold prices were.
So so what was your feelings like when you realized this on this outcrop, right? Because like I think that's one of the big things for like especially like junior geos that might be listening to this. My experience has been like you hear that description of the eureka moment. It's been very much like that in my experience. Where you're like, I can't believe this. This is amazing. Did you have something like that or?
Well, that day was one of those moments for me. Because all of a sudden I realized that it wasn't veins, wasn't vertical veins, and I didn't know what it was exactly, but all of a sudden it had potential that was far beyond what I understood or thought before, and what was understood before by the previous owners. So, I mean, it still probably wasn't their target. They were looking for a porphyry. They were looking for a standard Southwest US oil drum shaped porphyry, and that's actually roughly what they had on their map when I first arrived. And there's
Sometimes you
another.
find what you want to find.
It wasn't what they were looking for. So, and even what I found wasn't what they were looking for, but it turns out it was what Panos was looking for, and it turned into a mine. And then it went on from that. There were actually several epiphany moments in this one, and the second one was when they sort of got rolling on drill out of that gold thing. Then the country manager at the time, Ralph, what's his second name? I can't remember. He said, "Oh, look, copper price is coming up a bit. Do you want to have another look at the copper, which was the original target of this thing? The old drill core is stored in a shed in Vientiane somewhere. Go and dig it out and log it all again and replot all the sections and see if you can figure out what's going on. On top of I already had done the mapping on the surface. So, and the first thing, when I was mapping on the surface, there were a few exposures in the drill tracks and things, and I couldn't see any porphyry. Like everything I saw looked like a maybe porphyritic volcanic, but there were a lot of tuffs and sediments, and I couldn't see any like normal diorite porphyry that you're supposed to see in one of these porphyry, diorite porphyry systems. It didn't look right. So anyway, I thought, I better go and look at the core. So I went back and I looked at the core, and again, I couldn't see any porphyry. Well, not true. There were one or two little dikes of porphyry.
But
There
not the
were.
volume you'd be expecting, right?
It wasn't this big round blob that was on the map, and I was going, well, something's wrong here. So the first thing was where it did look like a porphyry because there was a huge volume of phyllic alteration. We're out in the boondocks, but there's just everything's phyllic alteration or propylitic. And it's volcanics, andesitic volcanics, right sort of address, but we just didn't seem to be in the porphyry. And there were even B-type veins. There were nice B-type veins with a centerline seam and, a bit of bornite in them, and that's where the gold was. So it was sort of like we're close to the action, but we haven't hit the target yet.
That's always one of those, both a frustrating and an exciting moment where you're like, okay, we're close. How do we get closer? Right?
Um, so the basic story, if you just ignore this bit here, which we didn't know about at the time, this was the main hill. The red things were the gossans, where all the gold was, and the blue lines are those B veins we could see. So there were lots of interesting things. And it all sat on top of a thrust. And the rocks below are the Karat Basin. This is all like Permian rocks, the volcanics, but the rocks underneath are Cretaceous sediments, red bed sediments of the Karat Basin. So they're dead. But so being Normandy Anglo, being a sort of American focused, they'd been drilling vertical holes, vertical diamond holes all the way through this thing, thrust sheet. And every time they hit that thrust, which was very obvious because of a huge quartz vein, they stopped. But there was just one hole. When I reconstructed the sections, I sort of came up looking like that. But there was just one hole out here somewhere that went vertical, and it went down in these volcanics, but it went way below where the thrust should have been, and it still was in volcanics. And it hit a couple of those little gossany-looking things. Actually, it was bedded sulfide at that point. And I went, ooh, the only way I can make that work when I'm drawing this section is to put another fault, this thing here, that cuts the thrust and drops it down. And on that day, there was that epiphany moment. It was like, well, gee whiz, that means that east of that thrust, east of that vertical fault, if that fault's real and it cuts the thrust, east of that, there could be a whole lot more of that host sequence, and there's virtually no drilling out here. So on that day, I went to the exploration manager, Ralph Child, his name was, and said, look, I want to drill an angled hole. I want to step back over here off to the east and drill an angled hole so that I can do two things. One, I want to test whether there is a big blob of the host sequence down there, and hopefully we'll go through this structure here, and that'll prove that there is a fault that cuts the thrust. They did that. They stepped back. They drilled the hole, and not only did we do exactly that, but on the way down, we went through a huge block of this green stuff, which is skarn, which we hadn't encountered. There was none of that up here. There was a huge blob of this skarn, silicate and magnetite skarn, that had twice the grade of the stockworks. And we hit a couple of little porphyry dikes that looked the business. Turns out they didn't have a lot of grade, but they were certainly the right sort of porphyry to drive a porphyry system. And it was clear that we were in a skarn system outside, close to, but outside, probably above the porphyry. And it was mineralised, and like I said, twice the grade of the stockwork. And suddenly there was a huge volume of extra material there, and it was twice the grade of the previous stuff.
That's one of those very exciting moments where it's, you get an explanation for the geology that matches what you were hoping, and then you also hit something that looks really encouraging too, right?
Well, again, was it luck? Was it good geology? Who was it the exploration manager who said, yep, go with that idea? Or he could have just said, nah, you're full of crap. You'll have to, come up with a better idea. Or was it the guy who first told Mike that, the place was called Pucam? Who along that chain? And then, of course, the project had to be drilled out. Share something else.
That's one
And
of the things I like with
that
Ahmad has a description of these are like a movie, and which frame of the movie is the discovery on, where it's usually like, well, all of these frames are important leading up to this scene, and so, but it can also have gone completely differently, right? It's really easy to say no. That's what I've learned throughout my career is it's far easier to say no to a target and drilling something than it is to say yes, right? So
Yeah, well, so for that exact reason, there are a dozen points along that chain where somebody has to go yes, and even if they go yes, it maybe the decision was wrong and it just turned out my interpretation might have been complete rubbish, and it might have turned out that we just drilled a bunch of granite. Uh, there is, in fact, a whole big fat pile of granite further east. Had we been a little too far north or too far south, we might have just drilled granite and got unlucky. So many things have to go right, and it just happened that we got the whole sequence right in that. And that
and then
thing that I'm sharing now is that's it today.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
a huge hole in the ground. So
And
um,
it's I think one of the things I was also thinking about is you were describing walking around on these drill pads. I've talked to geos who, have worked in projects with covered terrain and they go, well, there's no point in mapping because it's all regolith or whatever. And I've always just been like, I want to walk my drill pads and the drill roads and just see what I can see, even if it's all alluvium or whatever. Maybe I'll see something. Maybe you don't, and but if you don't ever get in the field, you're not gonna make these discoveries, right? You think about the change that you saw in the orientation from that one drill pad that happened to be in it, it starts this whole chain of events, right? And so if you hadn't have gone and walked your drill pads, you would have been probably walking away from these narrow, scraggly vertical veins, right? So
yeah, yeah. And if this, if that, the story of how I actually went to go to work on that project was some crazy thing where I, it was in the middle of a downturn, and I I was using borrowing a printer from a guy that ran a contracting agency, Simon Beams, and he just called me up one day because he knew I was sitting in my butt doing not much, and he said, "Oh, do you want to go and work in Laos?" And I went, "Well, where?" and then I looked it up on the sort of Googled it and went, "Oh, jeepers, there's all this unexploded ordnance, and there's actually in that particular area we were working some pretty cranky people who shot up the occasional bus." And I thought, oh, I could have just gone, nah, that
yeah.
might have been it.
Yep.
Just a million decisions along the way, and every one of them just happened to go right. But of course, if there's enough geologists out there doing things and exploration companies doing things, one somewhere along there will make that right chain. But
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can't just plan it from day one and say this is the sequence of things you have to do, because all the way along the chain there'll be random things happening, and you'll have to make decisions at that each of those points and make the right decision. Which, yeah, that's you got to get lucky sometimes, I think.
I think that's the thing that I enjoy so much about exploration is and I always compare it to fishing, right? Where it's like, you can know all of the techniques, you can know where the fish are gonna be, and you can cast to the exact right spot, but it's up to luck on whether there's a fish holding there or not, right? And I think that's and just like you can also be completely, dumb luck and you can catch fish with zero technique, knowing nothing about where they're gonna be. And that happens too in exploration, right? Where like people who didn't do any decent geology find stuff. That happens. But I kind of go back to like, well, we can stack the odds in our favor by doing better geology so that then if the luck side is there, well, maybe we'll make a discovery, right? So
Yeah, and I think that's reflected in the fishing story that there are people who go out there and just much more consistently come back with a bag of fish, and that's because they're experienced, and they've learned the hard way that you know you've got a better chance of going out on this day or using that kind of bait or this kind of technique, because that's just learned hard lessons. And rank amateurs can get lucky occasionally, but
yeah.
like you say, if you want to stack the odds in your favour, you've got to have people who've been there and done that in that area, in that type of fish,
Yeah.
stacking the odds, I guess that's what it's about.
So it must have been a big change too, where you went from being essentially the sole geologist with boots on the ground on this project to all of a sudden there's an exploration manager, there's probably a few other geologists. What was that change like? Was it a good change or was it a difficult change?
Well, it exploded, and it was already exploding because of the gold drill out. They were we went from living in bamboo shacks to having a full-size exploration camp with drillers and everything else and all the stuff that came with that, and of course, development geos and engineers coming in uh, and then it scaled up again when they started drilling out the skarn and, turned into a massive open pit mine.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
culture changes as well. It changes from, you know, the the exploration pointy end people out there, dealing with locals and everything on a daily basis to this kind of, military mindset of the mine development people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and for me that's not the bit that I enjoy. So ultimately I left when they
And that
started doing the serious drill out for the skarn part.
And that's very common with a lot of the explorers I've known who were they love that early stage. And I almost say the point where it changes is when you go from wearing a sun hat to wearing a hard hat, right? it's, it's it changes and it's different. And I've known people who, were requested to stay on through that and were just miserable, right? And then I have other people who love that environment, the hard hat environment and the regulate like the more regulated side of things. But it's almost typically like there's two kinds of people, right? Where it's the people who love this side and the people who love that side.
Yeah, and that in fact often is the death of companies because the the people that started it were exploration people and junior explorer type people. They know how to work in that environment and wing it when you have to and whatever. And when you put those people into the environment where they have to, you know, start filling out JORC statements and doing stuff in a systematic way, they often fail because it's just not their thing. It's not the way they're used to doing things. So a lot of juniors fail at that point. The whole thing collapses because they can't raise money because they haven't done the documentation right, or
Yeah,
they've
yeah.
annoyed someone along the chain, and the joint venture plummets. So there
There's
is
a lot
really
that falls over. Yeah.
50 things, but there is really a good argument for juniors exploring, finding things, and then handballing them on to miners who do mining, and then those people go off and do it again, exploring for other things. So I,
It's almost like you need a third set of companies, right? Where you have, like the people who are the early stage explorers. You have someone who's going to do all the work to convert it to something that the bigger companies are interested in buying. Because like I remember, like when I worked for the juniors, and we didn't collect our QT. Like we didn't do geotech. Like we had no idea about any of that stuff. And then the people who bought that project later were probably like, "What the hell is wrong with these geologists?" And so I think about, there was definitely a need for someone to handle that intermediate phase, right? Because we certainly didn't do it.
yeah, well, this particular company, Pan Australian, that I was working for, they went the full transition, and as I said, they came so close to failing financially. A couple of times we were sort of counting the days when we were going to get the pink slip, and at the last minute they raised some money and kept it rolling.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, it came very close to that for them, but it's one of the few where they did the full transition from small junior explorer to mid-tier mining company.
It's very hard. I remember I had a similar experience earlier in my career, and I remember like literally the power, getting shut off because they ran out of money, and we're looking at it going like, how are we possibly gonna do more drilling if we're out of money? And ultimately it turned into a mine, and it was not easy, and it was a lot of that wrangling and personality, and even just that transition from early stage to how do you develop it, and how do you raise money when you were an early stage explorer now going into development. It's a lot of complexities there, right? And I wonder how many companies fall over, and that's typically like a 10-year delay after that happens, right?
Mm.
Where like, they, especially if they go into receivership or something like that, it gets even more complicated, right? But it's like, I wonder how many companies are out there where they've found something and just were not suited for transitioning it over to the next phase. And then it just sat there and died.
Well, and perhaps if you're in that business, that's a business opportunity. There must be dozens of companies like that who actually have some asset that's not that damn bad, but they've fallen over because of some other issue, and they just can't get it up, and there it is, sit there stuck. Often, they're financially stuck as well, and someone doesn't want to exit at the right price or whatever. But sooner or later, the rocks don't go away. The companies live and die and go whatever, but the rocks don't go away.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's probably no, there are a lot of deposits which on their own, without the complexity of ownership on top of them right now, would be a mine, but for some bad history of development.
Yeah. Now, I interrupted you earlier, and you were going to talk about another, like a different discovery experience. Do you want to lead into that?
Okay, so when Pucam did become a mine, particularly the copper mine got started development, I was out of there. That's not, mine development isn't my thing. And whilst I been in Laos then for about 3 years, and I start to speak a bit of language, I'd compile a bunch of data. I knew how the system worked, and I thought, wow, gee whiz, that geology is over 2/3 of the country, and seems like great potential to do it again. Um, and there's like 3 exploration licenses in the whole country, and I thought, well, that looks like an opportunity. So I started up my own company to try and sort of replicate that thing. And I read the foreign investment law, looked pretty attractive. The mining law was pretty simplistic, but workable. And I thought, well, I'll just start my own company and go and start sort of developing targets and bring in investors from Australia and do it again. Um, should be easy, right?
This is you must have been young at this time, because I know I had a lot of these thoughts when I was younger too, and it seems so simple.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was an education, a very long, expensive, and but very educational, I would have to say. Anyway, uh, my first modus operandi was just to go and try and collect all the data that there was, because they hadn't had a mining industry. There was no sort of um, geological repository of information or open file system or anything. There were just a bunch of dusty old reports in the mines department. And so I went in there and I copied everything I could, and I digitized it all. I employed a bunch of local guys to enter all the data from the paper reports. And then I just went about going to look at things in the field to try and figure out if any of them looked attractive or not. And as it turned out, Newmont had done a similar thing to Normandy Anglo. They had a 5,000 square kilometre tenement out in western Laos, done a huge amount of work, all the stream sediments and mag and radiometrics, and just they'd identified, again, they were looking for porphyries. They'd identified a few targets. And uh, so I went to look at their sort of main targets that they'd identified, and to see if I, could get excited about any of them. And one was in their reports was described as this nice breccias with good gold grades, and there was some sort of big zones of it drawn in this sort of cartoonish map, and I thought, well, that looks all right. So they had this thing called inspection permits, where you could just get a permit to go out and have a look at something. Didn't give you any tenure, but you were allowed to go look. So I got one of these things, and I went out to have a look at this thing, and driving in there, we're driving in along a logging road, and when Newmont had been working there were no roads. They had to come in by boat. They came up the river in a boat, but now there's this logging track, and as I'm driving in along this track, I see a sign on a tree, a hand-painted thing in Laos, nailed to a tree in green paint, and we're sort of 10 kilometres from the target, and I asked my field hand sitting in next to me in the Toyota, what does that say? It doesn't say anything nasty like National Park or something. And he said, no, it says Skinhead Mountain. And I went, oh. And Lao is very literal language, so skinhead means bald, basically. So I thought, oh, Bald Mountain, there's quite a few ore deposits named things like Bald Mountain.
Yeah.
And for various reasons. Anyway, so we're driving along, and another couple of kilometres later, we come out of what was logged rainforest, a logging track, onto what is this grassy hill with a few cycads and things on it, and this rich black-brown soil. And I thought, that's odd. That soil looks really good, but it's not growing anything. Certainly not any forest. And but then I looked at the GPS, and we were still 5 kilometres from this target. Anyway, so off we went, and we spent a couple of days wandering around this target, and I found the breccias, but they were way smaller than they were in the cartoon map. And look, there was hardly any gossan in them, and I smacked off a few samples, but I just couldn't get excited. So I thought, well, look, let's go back to where that vegetation anomaly was, back on the hill there, and on the way home, and we'll spend a half a day there doing something. So we did, and I had 2 teams of guys, and I said, right, you go down that ridge, you go down that ridge, collect as many soil samples as you can in a day, and we'll see where we get with that. And I do have the numbers here somewhere. So on that day, 15th of February 2009, we collected 77 ridge and spur soil samples, at least my field hands did. And I walked around the rest of the hill trying to figure out what the geology was, and I couldn't. I couldn't figure out what it was.
That must have been interesting. Because you were pretty experienced at this time, right? So it's not like you're like some junior geo,
No, I'd been around. I was in my late 30s, and I'm going, I've been a geo for a while, and I can't name a single rock. I bashed open 50 rocks this afternoon, and I can't name one of them. They're all these strange things with weird chunks of feldspar, mafic minerals I don't recognise, and all this something that looked like a gossan after, I don't know, actinolite or something. I thought maybe it's some weird skarn because I can't recognise any of the minerals. Anyway, I had no idea what it was, but the soil was just dark brown, so there's a lot of iron in it. Anyway, and I couldn't see anything of quartz. No sample that I could break open had a piece of quartz in it.
Also interesting that there's no trees growing too, right? So
and
it's
there's
like
no trees.
there's
Something is poisoning the vegetation, or for something about this soil that the vegetation just doesn't like. So anyway, it looked really interesting. And I sent the samples off to the lab, and because there were no quartz in it, there seemed to be lots of iron. I also told them to do a digest for platinoids, which was another.
That's uncommon to request that, right? It's like not a lot of people would have been like, oh, let me just do some platinum group elements.
And it was expensive,
Yeah.
But fortunately, there was a lab in Vientiane. ALS had a lab there, and they could do it. So good-o. And a month later, they send me back these assay results, and I just about had to ring up the lab and said, look, I did request things in ppm, not ppb, and And I looked
That's
at
a
it
good
again and
sign.
again, and no, that was absolutely correct. And I checked with the lab, and they said, no, no, that's what it was. And of those 77 samples, 66 returned more than zero point 0.1 ppm platinum, along
Wow.
with 1 point up to 1.2% nickel and max out on chrome and all
You
kinds of
must have been
other
very excited.
stuff. And on that day, I just went, wow, if this is real, wait a minute, let me get those old Newmont reports. And I rushed to the cabinet and I pulled out all the old Newmont reports and flipped through them. And I was like, they never assayed for platinoids. They never assayed for chrome. All they did was copper, gold, arsenic, moly, and one or two other things, but nothing that might have indicated they'd been there. They'd actually taken a sample in a stream that came off the hill where we'd sampled it, but that's all they'd assayed for, and it didn't show up anything.
How how common is this in your experience? Because I've seen this a few times over the years where I've come onto a project later and been kind of blown away that they didn't assay for things. And I know people will subsequently come onto projects that I've worked on and wonder why I didn't assay for things. And it's, there's all the budgets and all the other, but sometimes you just don't know, right? And sometimes it's just totally out of your experience and you're like, I didn't think to do that. So
Well, well, of course, I wouldn't have thought to do it unless I'd been on the hill and seen something that triggered me that maybe there's more to this than a porphyry. It didn't look
yeah.
right for a porphyry. There was clearly something wacky going on. There were no ultramafics recorded in the entire country, but
Wow. Yeah.
but the and Newmont had a big regional map along with all that other work they'd done. They'd drawn this very detailed looking regional map, and there were no ultramafics on their geology map. And
And
look,
and here you have no courts at all.
and here I have these rocks that I can't identify, and they've got no quartz. And I thought, well, look, there's two things. If you can't identify any of the minerals, there's either one of two things: either a skarn or some ultramafic thing. That Anyway, that was the decision. That's what happened, and it was real. And then when I flipped back through that report, they had done aeromag, and there was an enormous mag anomaly, like 20 kilometers long, and linear looking thing, and they hadn't gone back to that because they were looking for porphyries that were round and they were donut shaped anomalies, of which there were several, and they'd targeted them. But this big long narrow thing, they'd ignored it because it didn't look right. So anyway, and the samples that we'd taken were just on the very southern tip of that. Anyway, then long story of trying to apply for a tenement, and it was just at the time when the government and all various people in the government were suddenly realising there was money in mining, and they didn't really want to give tenements to Western companies anymore. And anyway,
A
big
lot
fight.
changed right around then, yeah, huh?
Yeah. I was 5 years too late. I didn't realise that at the time, but that's what happened. Anyway, eventually I brought in Dominion Mining from Australia because they had a history of, doing stuff, and they had a pile of money in the bank because they'd sold a bunch of projects that they had in Australia. They were currently mining that Challenger thing in South Australia, high-grade gold thing underground, and making a ton of money. So they were the right sort of people had to be as partners, and they came over, had a look at it, got excited, and said, "Yep, let's go for it," and applied for a tenement. Nearly 2 years of fighting with the government to get said tenement, but eventually got granted. And then the story just augurs downwards from there on. Unfortunately, I think I've told that story in another interview before, but the bottom line was that the agreement was that should said tenement ever be granted, we would be in a joint venture with a series of terms that we'd agreed after much negotiation. But during that time, whilst negotiating the tenement with the government, Dominion got taken over by Kingsgate, who owned the Chattree mine in Thailand. And Kingsgate considered themselves a gold company, so they weren't really interested in platinum for a start. And number two, they really didn't like the deal that Dominion had signed with me. So when the day came that the government did actually sign the license and it was granted, they basically came to me and said, "Well, we're not going to sign. You know, just you don't like
Oh,
it, then see you in court." And
oh,
knowing
that's
full well
heartbreaking.
that I wouldn't be able to fight them in court, or at
Yeah,
least they
yeah.
would just grind me into the ground. So it didn't quite end there. Um, I mean, what you think about karma, but Kingsgate eventually got kicked out of Thailand because they hadn't met their commitments for um, Thai ownership after 10 years, which they were supposed to do. Amongst other things, they'd just been fighting with the government for a long time, got kicked out and went another way, and they handballed the project on to another small company, Mekong Minerals, who then tried to float it and uh, couldn't because the market was
Ugh.
down, and then they handballed it did a sort of a reverse takeover thing with Santana Minerals, who then raised $3 million, I think, private to try and do something with it. But in that process, when they were trying to float it, they looked at the contracts that were associated with the lease and said, "Oh, there's this JV that you guys should have signed." And they wouldn't let them put the float documents together without signing that thing. So eventually they did sign, not
Mm.
Kingsgate, the subsequent
Yeah, yeah, the
owners, and
subsidiary, yeah.
yada yada yada. But anyway, it's just been a mess ever since, and so it's still
It's
sitting
gotta
there.
be it's gotta be heartbreaking, right? Because like, a part of you's gotta wonder, how big is it? What's the legs of this thing? What's it gonna turn into? And not knowing is so painful, right?
Oh, look, so much of, a long history of, like I said, it was an education, not just in geology, but in the whole business side of it, the government side, the dealing with people, the money, it was just a huge education, expensive, painful, and long, but I learned a lot. And,
Yeah.
it now reflected, of course, in the things that I do now and don't do.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Which I think is that's always the hard part, right? It's all of our subsequent history up to that point guides our future decisions for better and for worse, right? And it can change your risk aversion very rapidly when you've been burned like that, right? It's hard.
yeah, well, like I said, the rocks don't change. That thing still there. That soil anomaly after, Dominion came back and did a huge big soil program, some geological mapping, and look, that the soil anomaly plus zero point 0.1 ppm platinum was 9 kilometres long and 700 metres wide. And it's basically, it's an ultramafic complex, a layered ultramafic complex sticking out of the ground. That's what's the vegetation anomaly. Had I walked a little bit further down the creek that afternoon, I would have seen dunites outcropping in the creek.
Oh,
Um,
that's cool.
so, yeah, this full-on ultramafic complex, classic thing. But there's argument about what style of ultramafic. I'm no expert on ultramafics, but it's been compared to the Great Dyke in Zimbabwe, or possibly that Stillwater thing. And
Mhm.
they're notorious for being difficult to find ore bodies in. They're big, but finding actual ore bodies in them is notoriously difficult. So look,
Yeah.
I chalked it up to experience, and but oh, and I forgot that along the way, when various owners were trying to do stuff with it, every man and his dog put up his hand to say, "Oh, we discovered this thing," as they were spruiking it to their investors. No,
It's
this one,
it's
I
so
found it, and there were no
yeah.
previous workings. There was no records on the geological maps. There was no information at all other than that anomaly, that vegetation anomaly, and the decision I made on that day was the discovery. Is it a discovery? It's not a mine yet. Well, people might argue it's not even a discovery, but it was.
It's It's always kind of fascinating, that stuff, right? Like, I know a variety of people over the years who were, like, phenomenal geologists and made, like, legitimate discoveries, and essentially in the process of selling or JVing or whatever their deal was, got totally burned. Nobody recognizes them as the discoverer, and all their hard work gets thrown out. And it's kind of heartbreaking to see how common that is in geology, where it's pretty cutthroat, right? It's I don't know. It's easy to pretend that things are nice and civilized, and I think the reality is there's like, I can't remember the guy's name right now, but he used to write this great, column on geology and, if I remember his name, I'll say it later, but anyways, I used to love reading it because it was so much of it was my experience with some of the smaller companies and some of the just the cutthroat deals that are going on, and often when you're like an individual, you don't have the resources to fight things like that, right? Like, you're not gonna sit in court for 10 years and go through something, right? It's just, you've got a mortgage, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So what was, I guess, what was your favorite part of being an individual discoverer versus part of a geological team? Like, what were your favorite parts of those 2 different aspects?
Ever since I was a kid, I always enjoyed that, you know, lone wolf thing, being out in the field. That's why I'm a geologist. That's why I'm still in the field, because I just that high I get from, and it doesn't have to be an autopilot, but every day you go out and you spot something that nobody else has seen before, or it means something that nobody else has recognized before. And that, to me, there's no better feeling. So, I'm hooked on it. There's no way I could do any other job where I sat in the office all day and just, spat stuff out. That
I think
that
that's yeah, like, the field is truly where I've encountered that feeling more often doing field work than anything else I've done, from drilling to modeling or anything else, like, all those things are necessary, right? But it's like that just excitement is something else, so, huh.
Yeah, yeah, and, I got hooked on that from an early age because I took these sort of holiday jobs where I was mapping for companies, and I'd find stuff, I'd just wander out in the field and I'd just find stuff, and, you know, that was just so exciting for me that I couldn't give that up. And every time I looked like having to do something in an office for an extended period of time, I was just like, "Nah, get me out of here. Beam me up, Scotty, now."
I don't know, I still remember that the first geology job I had out of school, and my boss was like, "Don't talk to any other geologists, don't look at any geological maps, just go out and figure out this thing." And I went out and I remember just looking at the rock and just going, "I don't even know what type of rock this is. I just wasted a lot of money on my degree." And then I was like, "No, no, no, I need to sit here and figure this out." And so it was like, started going, "Okay, start at the basics, describe the phenocrysts, like," and eventually it's so funny in hindsight because I was like, "That's a rhyolite," and I was so excited, right? And now I'm like, "Oh, it's so painful to think of." And then going along and then figuring out, "Oh, this other rock's an andesite," and then looking at the zone in between these two and being like, what is going on here? It's like this weird mix of rhyolite and andesite and clay, and it's 10 meters wide, and then like realizing it was this big fault with like gouge with like a class of both rocks in it, and just I still remember how exciting that moment was, and it's one of the simplest geological, like, I wouldn't even call it like a discovery, but the geological realizations, and just I love that. That's that you get hooked on that of just you make a hypothesis today and you might answer it tomorrow, right? And it's just fun.
Yeah, well, I think in my sort of introductory, video for my YouTube channel, I got this thing is, uh, comparing geology exploration anyway to, crime scene investigation. It's like there's all these scattered pieces of evidence, and some of it's covered up, and some of it's you know rubbish, and some of it's not real. And when you sift through it all and put together all those little things, and then you find that one little piece of evidence that just makes it all fit together, that you know if you're at all into sort of true crime novels and things, then you should be a geologist, because it's just you live that every day. That's the job. Except it's
I
not people
agree.
trying to kill you.
Yeah, it's a little less pressure, you know? It's I don't know, I think that's the amazing part of geology that doesn't get talked about enough is that you have a puzzle in front of you that is so complicated, and yet you start to unravel it, and you start to put the pieces together, and it just the excitement just builds and builds and builds, and it's addictive, right? It's just it's fun. So
Yeah. Yeah, it is, and, well, that's why I'm still doing it because, it's just it's just a whole bunch of fun to and like I said, they don't have to you don't have to discover ore body every day. There are other little tiny discoveries, those little pieces of the puzzle that you pick up in the field and you suddenly, it just changes the picture, and to me, that's the excitement every
yeah,
day. You don't
yeah.
have to discover an ore body every day. You just there's every day, there's some little puzzle piece that oh, occasionally you have a crap day and you get bogged in the mud and you it rains
Yeah,
and it's bad, but you know that
those are all part of
tomorrow
the story.
yeah, it's all part of the
Yep. I mean, that's the stuff that I think about, like where when I've talked to like high schoolers or grade schoolers, and sometimes the stories of where you got 3 flat tires and you had 4 spare tires, and you're driving back to town and you hear the last valve stem start leaking air, and you're like, oh, we're on number 4 today, and I still have 10 miles to go. It's it's terrible at the time, right? And looking back, I just love those experiences. They're so wild, and some of them sound so fake, right? Where it's like, there's no way that could have possibly happened, and it's like, that's just the weird part of being in the field, right? So it's I don't know. I still firmly believe that the field is where discoveries are made because the rocks are constantly giving you new ideas, right? Where just like you talked about in that section earlier, where you drilled a few holes and you might not even have a section. You've hand drawn something in your notebook, and you're like going, okay, they're here, here, and here, and you're trying to do the trig, and then all of a sudden there's something that's clearly fallen off the face of the earth, and you're like, why is it 100 meters deeper over here? What's gone on? And then you're like, let's go back over there and see if we can find any surface expression, and then, sometimes you find, I don't know, like recessively weathered, just like a little tiny low on the ridge line. And it's like, oh, maybe there's a dike that's filling this fault. And let's see if we can find any evidence of this. And it's just a kick.
yeah, and there's that thing about working with a team and having it, particularly the backing of a company with lots of resources. I remember after that experience with the bedded gossan thing, I went back to Ralph Child and remember sitting in his office and saying, um, if these things are horizontal, we're going to need a lot of drill holes, to drill out a resource. There's going to be a lot of, just pattern drilling basically. And so I said, so what kind of budget have I got here? How many meters can I have to drill this idea? And he sort of thought about it for a second, and then he said, look, you tell me how many drill holes you need, and I'll find the money. And I went, right then. You beauty, unlimited drill budget, I'm on it. And I just basically looked at everywhere I thought there might be one of these things and pattern drilled it. And, just amazingly, it turned out that most of it was actually ore. So that became an ore body. It's just amazing. Which, well, if Ralph had sort of gone, oh, gee, raising money right now could be a bit tricky. You can have a couple of 100 meters, and I might have missed on the first couple of holes. But you know, it,
I I think about that a lot with I sometimes think that we think we're smarter than we are or luckier than we are when you say, "Oh, we're gonna give you 3 holes to find something," and it's like, the odds of that are so tiny, right? And it takes someone like that where, like, they really, go to bat to get you the funding so that you can do the right work, and then in hindsight, there's so many ways that can go wrong, but he was the right person at the right time, and you were the right person at the right time, and it's off to the races.
Yeah, well, and there again, there's that thing, is that so who discovered it? Like, there was 20 people involved at 20 critical points that everything had to go exactly, make the right call at that right moment, and, you know, that's what it is, and most of the time, that's what it is, and my other experience was extremely rare, where a lone individual working alone with no I funded all of that work that I was doing entirely out of my own consulting money that I'd earned, going to work for Pubia and various other people. So it's just it's just not a common thing, particularly these days, where uh, in a lot of countries anyway, it's simply not possible for one person to have enough resources to even get all the paperwork done before you start cracking rocks. So it's you know we're talking about a whole other issue of declining discovery rates. Well, my opinion is that the main reason for that is just the friction now that's involved in doing exploration. It's just so complex and so expensive to get started that people with good ideas and enthusiasm just get ground down before they even get to the field, let alone whether or not they have the skills in the field.
Yeah, I think that's it's so easy to overlook that, and yeah, exactly, the complexity of it just grinds away, and, versus being able to throw one of those backpack drills on an outcrop and test an idea, in an afternoon. It's a very different world, right? And I don't think you can overstate that enough, that it's easy to grind away the people who are really genuine explorers. Kind of like we were talking about earlier, like, the sun hat versus the hard hat, right? Is like a lot of those sun hat folks don't deal well with the bureaucracy and the all the hurdles that need to be jumped before you can even get a rig turning on the ground or even get out to a project to map, right? So
Mm. Yeah.
I was gonna ask, what of all the experiences you had in these 2 discoveries, what stayed with you that's changed the way you go about exploration now?
Big thing for me, that I learned out of that long and painful experience, well, painful? I had a hell of a lot of fun. It wasn't painful. I just had a lot of fun, but just didn't actually turn up a giant result for me. But the thing I learned is that discovering mineral deposits is the easy bit. That actually finding things in the field isn't that hard. Turning them into mines that produce stuff is the tricky bit. And so much, and it just a lot more difficult now than it was when I was working then. So before I even start in a place, I would say, what's the tenure? What are the conditions? What are the uh, does the government really want mining? That I made a video not long ago about you know jurisdictional risk, basically, and how it goes through sequence cycles as this kind of a sine wave of the government wanting mining and not wanting mining. And there's a very narrow window on the upswing of that curve where successful exploration projects happen. And that's what I learned in Laos, because I was there long enough to see pretty much the whole cycle. Um, that that is the most important thing for exploration, not the geology, not even the people. The people are second. You need good people who are enthusiastic and know the stuff. But even those people in the wrong environment will never make a mine, because if the government really doesn't want mining, and that even comes to just apathy, they have to want mining, as Laos did when in 2003 when I first turned up, then you can make mines out of good prospects. But if they don't, or even they're just apathetic to it, it'll never happen. You'll just be wasting your time.
Digging deep where the stories hide, through the hills and the mountains wide. Pickaxe swing and the earth unfolds, chasing dreams in the dirt and gold. Geology calling under our feet, secrets are buried in the rock and heat. With a heart full of wonder and a map in hand, exploring the treasures of this great land.